Okay, so tariffs have been on my mind a lot lately. Specifically, how they can impact American farmers.
Yeah.
Like in 2018, remember when former President Trump proposed all those tariffs on Mexico and Canada and China, and things got kind of crazy?
Oh, yeah, for sure. The global economy really felt that.
I think some people would argue that American farmers really paid the price.
It's interesting how these things can have such ripple effects. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like one decision can impact so many things.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So what happened? Like, what were the biggest changes for the agriculture industry?
Well, one of the biggest was how China responded.
Good.
Because they were such a huge buyer of American agricultural products. And when the U.S. imposed those tariffs, China basically said, all right, we'll go somewhere else.
So they started looking for new suppliers.
Exactly. And Brazil was a prime candidate.
Why Brazil?
Well, they had a similar climate. They were already producing a lot of the same products as the U.S., like soybeans, and they were ready to step up and expand their market share.
Interesting. So China shifted their buying power to Brazil.
Exactly. And that had a huge impact on American farmers.
Yeah, I was reading about how Washington apple farmers were hit particularly hard.
Oh, absolutely. They were dealing with rising costs, prices weren't going up, and then boom, they lost access to these huge export markets like India and China.
Because of those retaliatory tariffs.
Exactly. It was like a perfect storm, and a lot of farmers ended up going bankrupt or consolidating.
Wow. It's one thing to read about this stuff, but it must have been devastating for those farmers.
Absolutely. Their livelihoods were completely upended, and it's a classic example of how interconnected global trade really is. When one country makes a move, everyone feels it.
So what about other types of farmers? Like, did soybean farmers feel the impact too?
Oh, big time.
Even though they weren't directly involved with the apple situation?
Right, because China is the biggest buyer of U.S. soybeans.
Oh.
So when they started buying from Brazil, soybean farmers in Illinois, for example, were in big trouble.
Wow. So this really affected the entire agricultural landscape.
Absolutely. It highlights this whole web of relationships and dependencies in global trade.
So did the U.S. government do anything to help the farmers who were struggling?
Yeah, they stepped in with subsidies.
Like financial assistance?
Exactly. They were trying to lessen the negative impacts on farmers.
And where did that money come from?
Taxpayers, of course.
Right. So it was a massive effort to help. But I'm guessing it also raised some questions.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Like about how sustainable this kind of intervention really is.
Exactly. And whether it's actually effective in the long run.
Right. It makes me wonder if something like this were to happen again, would we see those same subsidies?
That's a tough question to answer, but I think to really understand the potential impact, we need to look at the bigger picture of agriculture's role in the U.S. economy.
Okay, let's do that. How important is agriculture to the U.S. economy overall?
Well, it's not just important, it's huge. Agriculture is a major part of our exports.
Like how much are we talking?
Well, for example, about 16% of all the corn produced in the U.S. is sold internationally. And for soybeans, it's even more, around 40%.
Wow. I didn't realize it was that much.
Yeah, so when things get disrupted in the agricultural sector, like we saw with the tariffs, the entire U.S. economy feels it, not just the farmers.
So we're talking about potential impacts on things like grocery prices or even jobs in completely different industries.
Exactly. It's all
Yeah,
connected.
it's like a chain reaction.
Exactly, like those food processing plants or transportation companies, even manufacturing. They all depend on agricultural products in some way.
So if something disrupts that flow, it creates a domino effect.
Absolutely. And then you have things like increased costs.
Right.
And those costs often get passed down to us, the consumers.
So suddenly our grocery bills are higher.
Exactly. It can have a very real impact on your wallet.
Yeah, it's easy to forget that sometimes.
Absolutely. And there's another layer to all this that we need to think about.
Okay, what's that?
The geopolitical side of things.
Ah, right.
Like, while American farmers were struggling, other countries were making some pretty strategic moves.
Like what?
Well, China, for example. They've been increasing their influence in Latin America.
I've heard about that, but I'm not really sure what it all means.
It's a big deal. Basically, China has been investing heavily in Latin America, strengthening ties with countries like Panama and Honduras.
Right.
And that creates new markets and supply chains that bypass the U.S.
So it kind of weakens American influence in the region.
Yeah, you could say that. It creates a whole new set of challenges and opportunities in global trade.
Interesting. So it's something we need to be paying attention to.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we've talked about the potential downsides of tariffs.
Right.
But what about the arguments for them? Like, why do some people support using tariffs?
Well, it's complicated. But supporters often say that tariffs protect domestic industries and jobs.
Okay, how so?
By making foreign goods more expensive, it encourages people to buy American-made products, which can help boost the local economy.
So it's like a buy American strategy.
Exactly. But of course, critics have their concerns.
Like what?
Well, they argue that tariffs ultimately hurt consumers.
By raising prices.
Exactly. And they also limit our choices. And then there's the whole issue of retaliation.
Right, like other countries responding with their own tariffs.
Exactly. It can trigger these trade wars that disrupt global markets.
Which is what happened back in 2018.
Exactly.
So are tariffs actually effective as a trade policy tool?
Well, the evidence is kind of mixed.
How so?
Some industries might see some benefits, like the steel industry in the U.S., but other sectors often suffer because of those retaliatory tariffs.
So it's not a simple win-lose situation.
Definitely not. It's a lot more nuanced than that.
We have to remember that we're talking about real people and businesses here.
Absolutely.
So let's bring this into the present day. It's 2025, we're under President Biden, and the economy seems to be doing well.
Right.
Record job growth, the stock market is up, we're seeing investments in infrastructure. So in this context, could a return to those aggressive tariff policies disrupt this progress?
That's the big question, isn't it? Like, a lot of economists and policymakers are worried about that.
Because it could potentially undo a lot of the positive things that are happening.
Exactly. Like imposing new tariffs on major trading partners like Mexico, Canada, or China.
Right.
That could trigger a whole chain reaction that undermines the current stability.
So it's kind of like walking a tightrope.
It is. We're trying to balance domestic interests with global trade, and one wrong step could have major consequences.
It sounds pretty risky.
It can be, but it's also an opportunity
To do what?
to find new ways to engage in global trade that benefit everyone.
Okay, so before we dive into the potential consequences of these trade tensions, let's take a step back and recap what we've learned so far. Okay, so we've talked about the history, we've talked about the impact on farmers, and we've talked about those potential trade wars.
Right.
So what happens next? Like, if these tensions keep escalating, what are some possible outcomes?
Well, it's hard to say for sure, but we can look at what's happened in the past and what's happening right now to get some ideas.
Okay, so what are some of those ideas?
Well, one possibility is that we see a repeat of 2018.
With the tariffs and everything?
Exactly. Like this back and forth escalation of tariffs until it becomes a full-blown trade war.
And what would that mean?
Well, it would disrupt global supply chains.
Okay.
And likely hurt businesses and consumers on all sides.
So higher prices.
Yeah, most likely. And fewer choices. And just general economic instability.
So basically a lose-lose situation for everyone.
Pretty much. Another possibility is that all this tension could fuel inflation.
How so?
Well, if those tariffs make imported goods more expensive,
Right.
businesses might have to raise their prices just to stay afloat.
To protect their profits.
Exactly. And then those costs get passed down to the consumer.
And we're already seeing some inflation.
We are. So a trade war could make things even worse.
That's a scary thought.
It is,
Yeah.
especially for lower-income households.
Because they're the ones who feel the impact of rising prices the most.
Exactly. They often have the least wiggle room in their budgets.
Right. And then there's the impact on government spending, too.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Like, if the U.S. decides to help farmers out again with those subsidies, that adds to our national debt.
So these policies have a ripple effect on everything.
They do. The costs go way beyond just the immediate economic impacts.
Okay, so it sounds like there are a lot of potential downsides to bringing back those tariffs. Are there any upsides, like any potential benefits we should consider?
Well, some people argue that tariffs could help boost domestic production and create jobs.
Okay, I can see that.
The idea is that when foreign goods get more expensive, people are more likely to buy American-made products.
Which helps the local economy.
Exactly. But like we talked about before, the data from 2018 suggests those benefits might not be that significant.
And they often come at a cost to other sectors.
Right.
So it's a complicated issue with a lot of moving parts.
It really is, but it's something we all need to be aware of.
Because it affects all of us.
Absolutely.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground today.
We have.
We've looked at the history of these trade tensions, how tariffs impacted American farmers, and what could happen if things escalate.
It's been a fascinating conversation.
It really has. And hopefully, our listeners have a better understanding of how complex global trade really is.
I hope so. and how important it is to consider all sides of the issue.
Definitely.
Yeah.
We've just scratched the surface, but hopefully this has given everyone some food for thought.
Absolutely.
As we wrap up, we want to leave you with one final question to think about.
Okay.
How do you think these trade tensions will play out in the future? What does it mean for consumers, businesses, and the global economy?
It's a big question.
It is. And we encourage everyone to keep learning about these issues and share their thoughts and insights.
Because the more informed we are as individuals, the better we can engage in these conversations and advocate for policies that benefit everyone.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the world of trade and tariffs.
It's been a pleasure.
We'll see you next time for another deep dive into a pressing issue.
Until then, keep learning and keep the conversation going.